She had not planned to be there when her life changed for the second time. Seraphine Cresto stood at the south end of Lady Hestwick's ballroom on a cold October evening in 1826, in plum silk she had not worn since her mother's funeral. Her mother's pearls cool against her throat, and she was watching the fifth set dissolve into conversation and the movement of servants with fresh glasses. Beside her, her cousin Corinna was describing something about the flower arrangements. Dahlias, she thought, or possibly chrysanthemums. And Seraphine was listening with the part of her mind she reserved for social occasions, which was not her best part. She had promised to stay until 11. It was 10 past 10. She was calculating the exact number of minutes remaining when Corinna stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence about chrysanthemums. And Seraphine followed her cousin's eyes across the room, through a break in the dancers, and saw Lord Ashford Trevelyan standing 40 feet away, looking directly at her. He had not been in England. She had not known he was in England. And yet there he was, older, broader through the shoulders, his dark hair gone silver at the temples, and his face, when he saw hers, changed in a way she had not expected and did not have a name for. He said something to the woman beside him, who turned out to be his sister Cressida, and Cressida drew a slow breath and looked away, and Ashford began to cross the floor. "Sari," Corinna said very quietly. "That is—" "I know, Corinna," Seraphine said. "Stay." She did not move. She had spent 21 years learning not to move when she did not wish to, and she did not wish to now. She kept her glass in her right hand, the stem between two fingers, and she stood where she was and waited for him to arrive. Because he was going to arrive whether she moved or not. And she had long since stopped doing things simply to make other people's approaches feel less like what they were. He arrived. He bowed. She curtsied, precisely the depth appropriate to his rank, and not 1 inch more. Around them, 6 guests had registered the crossing of the floor and were watching without appearing to watch. "Lord Ingelo," she said. "Miss Cresto," he said, and then, after a pause that lasted just long enough to feel like tenderness, "I did not know you were in England." "I have never left England," she said. "I live 12 miles from here." Something moved in his face. He had not known that either, apparently, or had forgotten, or had decided that 12 miles was a kind of absence. He looked at her face, at the plum silk, at whatever it was that 21 years left on a woman who had spent them working. And he said, with what she recognized, to her genuine amazement, as warmth, "Seraphine, forgive me, but you have aged badly." The 6 nearby guests heard it. Corinna's breath stopped. The vicar's wife, 2 yards to the left, dropped her fan. Seraphine did not move. She did not set down her glass. She looked at him, not coldly, because she was past cold. And she said, audibly enough for every one of those 6 guests to carry home with them, "And you have aged alone, Ashford. I think that is worse." The silence in the 6-foot radius was immediate and total. Cressida, who had followed her brother at a careful distance, pressed her eyes shut. Ashford did not speak. He had no sentence. He stood and looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since 1805. And the thing in his face was not anger, and it was not contempt. It was the expression of a man who has just been contradicted by the only person in the world withstanding to contradict him, and who does not yet know what to do with that. Seraphine turned to Corinna. "I shall go home, cousin. You have been a splendid hostess." She turned back to Ashford and curtsied once more, precisely, civilly. "Good evening, my lord." She walked away. She did not hurry. She did not turn back. In the carriage home, Cressida sat across from her brother and watched him look out the window at the dark countryside. And after some time he said without turning, "How long has she been like that?" Cressida considered him for a moment. "Ashford," she said, "you left 21 years ago. How long do you imagine?" He did not answer. The carriage moved through the dark, and he went on looking out the window, and Cressida led him. The following morning at 7 o'clock, Corinna was at Seraphine's door, still in her traveling cloak, her eyes showing the effects of a short and troubled night. Seraphine opened the door herself, and Corinna stepped inside, and they embraced, briefly and without ceremony, the embrace of women who have known each other since childhood and do not need to perform their affection. "Don't leave like this," Corinna said. "Darling," Seraphine said, "I am not leaving like anything. I am going home. I will write from Cresto." She held her cousin's face between her hands for a moment, then released her. "You were a very fine hostess." The chrysanthemums were lovely. By 8:30, she was in a carriage heading west, and the plum silk was folded in her trunk. And she did not think about Ashford Trevelyan for the rest of the journey, because she had long since stopped doing that. Cresto Cottage was a 3-roomed house attached to the east side of the rectory, and Seraphine had lived in it for 15 years, since her uncle Humphrey had been given the living, and she had come to keep his house and found, in the parish, the work she had been doing quietly on her own since she was 24. The lying-in charity occupied a converted outbuilding behind the village's largest farm. And on the Thursday after her return from the Hestwick ball, Seraphine was at her desk by 7 in the morning, checking the charity's ledger against a list of expected confinements for the coming month. There were 4. Mrs. Albee, Mrs. Denton, a young woman in the eastern hamlet whose name Seraphine entered in the ledger with particular care because she was unmarried and 17, and a 4th whose husband had written twice to say his wife would not require assistance, and who Seraphine had visited anyway, on the grounds that men who wrote twice to say their wives did not require assistance were generally men whose wives most did. She wrote a letter to Dr. Fenn in Edinburgh regarding a question about presentation in late labor, sealed it, and set it on the hall table for the Morning Post. Then she put on her heavy cloak and walked to the lying-in house to attend a confinement with Mrs. Caraway, the midwife, who was a small, deliberate woman of 53, who had been delivering children in the parish since before Seraphine arrived, and who had, over the course of 15 years, arrived at a working partnership with her that neither of them had ever found it necessary to name. Ashford, at the Ingelo estate 20 miles to the north, sat down to write on the 4th day after the ball and produced half a page before stopping. He sat down again on the 9th day and produced 3 pages before tearing them. Both attempts he sealed and addressed to Miss Cresto at Cresto Cottage, and both were returned to him within a week, the envelopes unopened, his own handwriting on the front crossed through and replaced by hers on the outside. Returned to sender, at Cresto. It was the first time he had seen her handwriting since 1805. He held each envelope for a long time before he broke the return seal. And each time he opened it, he read nothing, because she had returned them unopened, and that was the point. Lady Honoria Ingelo Trevelyan, his elder half-sister, wrote from her house in Bath within the fortnight. She had heard, she said, from Lady Hestwick's daughter-in-law, who had heard from her husband, who had spoken to 2 people who had been standing within earshot. She urged Ashford, in the measured language of a woman who had spent 40 years managing the Ingelo reputation, not to pursue any approach to Miss Cresto, for reasons she listed in order of their importance to the family name. He read the letter. He did not reply. 6 weeks after the ball, Ashford left the Ingelo estate in the care of his steward, and took a room at the Gloved Hare, an inn in the parish of Aldenmere, not Seraphine's village, but the one adjacent to it, close enough that a letter sent in the morning would arrive before noon. Mr. Finch, the innkeeper, received him without ceremony and asked how long he intended to stay. Ashford said he was not certain. Mr. Finch said the room was available indefinitely and brought him a pot of tea. He wrote the letter over 2 days, unsealed, 4 pages in his own hand. He told her what he had believed at 27, that a rector's daughter, however intelligent, however willing, could not have known what she was consenting to when she agreed to be a diplomat's wife. The cold houses, the particular loneliness of a foreign posting, the years without a fixed home, the way a diplomatic life consumed the people adjacent to it. He told her he had believed, with complete sincerity, that he was sparing her. He told her that for 21 years he had maintained that narration, that he was the man who had done a hard and necessary thing out of care for her, and that the narration had required a woman who needed sparing, and that the actual woman was someone he had refused to know, because knowing her would have made what he had done impossible to justify. He did not frame this as an apology. He framed it as a correction of his own record, which was the only honest thing he could offer. He signed it Ashford, not Ingelo, and sent it to the cottage with a note on a separate sheet explaining that the letter was unsealed and that she might return it in the same envelope if she found it unacceptable, and that he would understand. She opened it. She read it once, at her desk, with her tea cooling beside her and the morning light coming through the east window. She set it down when she finished and sat for a time looking at the garden wall. Then she put on her cloak and her walking boots and walked to Aldenmere. She asked for Lord Ingelo by name at the Gloved Hare, and Mr. Finch sent a boy upstairs, and she waited at the foot of the stairs. Ashford came down in his shirt sleeves, he had been writing, and stopped 4 steps from the bottom when he saw her standing in the entrance hall of the inn in broad December daylight, her cloak dusted with frost from the road, her hands at her sides. "Ashford," she said, "I have read your letter. I am not going to answer in writing. I am going to tell you 3 things, and then I am going to leave, and you will not follow me." He steadied himself against the rail. "Yes," he said. 1. The letter is the first correct thing you have said to me in 21 years. I want you to know I noticed." "Thank you," he said. He was holding the stair rail with his left hand, and he was not moving. 2. I am not going to forgive you, not because I'm angry. I am past angry, because forgiveness is not the sentence I intend to give. I want to give a different one, if I give one at all. "I understand," he said. 3. She looked at him steadily. "Your late wife owned a pamphlet on the care of women in labor, published by a gentlewoman. It is likely still in her effects in Vienna. I wrote it. Her cousin Baroness Metternich wrote to me twice in 1818 for clarification on a passage about presentation in labor. I answered both letters. I knew your wife had read it. I did not tell you because I did not correspond with you. This is information, not reproach. Do with it what you will." Ashford did not sit down. He did not speak for a count long enough that Mr. Finch, at the far end of the entrance hall, found a reason to be in the back room. "Seraphine," Ashford said, "I am not finished." She kept her eyes on his face. 6 weeks from tonight, if you are still at this inn, I will send a note telling you whether I will permit you to attend the parish lying in as a visitor. If the note does not come, you will leave and not return. Is that acceptable?" He answered without hesitation and without negotiation. "Yes," he said. "Good afternoon, Ashford." She left. He stood at the foot of the stairs and listened to the door close. And Mr. Finch came back through from the rear of the inn and said, very carefully, "Another pot of tea, my lord?" "Yes, Mr. Finch," Ashford said. In the room. He climbed the stairs. He sat at the writing table. He did not write anything for 6 days. The note from Cresto Cottage arrived at the Gloved Hare on the 42nd day, delivered by a boy who waited for no reply because there was none required. Ashford broke the seal and read it standing at the window of his room, with the winter fields visible below and the smell of candle wax from the night before still in the air. "You may attend the parish, lying in as a visitor on the 3rd Thursday of January. You will not be introduced. You will observe, and then you will leave. S. Cresto." He read it once. He set it on the writing table. He stayed. 3 days after the note arrived, Lady Honoria came to the Gloved Hare. She sat in the downstairs parlor and addressed her brother with the particular precision of someone who had prepared their argument on the road. She was not cruel about it. She named the family, the title, the question of what it would mean for Oberon's prospects if his father were seen to be pursuing a woman of no estate. She named the ball, which she had not attended but had been told about at length. And she said that whatever had occurred there had been remarked upon, and that the remark was not to the family's benefit. Ashford listened. He said he understood her concern. He did not commit to either course, and Lady Honoria, who knew her brother, recognized this for the answer it was and took her leave. Several days after that, a letter arrived for Seraphine at the cottage, in Lady Honoria's hand. Seraphine read it at the breakfast table while her Uncle Humphrey ate his egg across from her and did not comment because he had learned, in 15 years, when to comment and when not to. Lady Honoria asked her to consider the Ingelow name and the standing of the family, and whether a connection of this nature was truly what either party required. Seraphine wrote back the same afternoon 2 sentences. "I have considered the Ingelow name for 21 years, Lady Honoria, without ever asking it to consider me. I intend to continue in that practice." She sealed it, sent it, and went to check on Mrs. Denton, whose time was approaching. Then, during those same weeks of imposed quiet, a letter came from Oberon at Harrow, a boy's letter, cheerful and artless, describing a master who was too strict and a friend who had beaten him at chess 3 times running. Near the end, almost as an aside, Oberon mentioned that a pamphlet on the management of women in labor was circulating among the older boy's sisters, copied out from one of the master's wives, and that it was said to be written by a gentlewoman from the west of England, and that several of the boys had been teased about it. He did not know what it had to do with anything. He was reporting it as a curiosity. Ashford read the letter at the writing table in his room, at the Gloved Hare, with the winter light coming flat through the window. He set it down when he finished. He did not move for some time. Outside, a cart went along the road below, and the horse's breath made small clouds in the cold air. And Ashford sat in his chair and thought about a woman who had read Italian and French and German at 24, who had been preparing, with her father's knowledge. She had said nothing of this. But he understood it now. For exactly the life he had decided she could not bear. Ashford attended the lying-in on 3 consecutive Thursdays in January. He carried water. He held doors. He said nothing that was not directly requested of him, which was very little. Mrs. Carroway noted him with the brief, assessing look of a woman who had no interest in titles and considerable interest in whether a person would be useful or in the way. And she appeared, after the first Thursday, to have arrived at a provisional conclusion. On the second Thursday, Lady Honoria arrived at the lying-in house unannounced. She had driven from Bath, which was a full day's journey, and she appeared in the doorway of the converted outbuilding in her traveling clothes with the expression of a woman who expects to find something shabby and has prepared her vocabulary accordingly. What she found was Mrs. Carroway directing two women in the cleaning of linen with the authority of a general. A ledger on the side table that was clean and precise and went back 15 years. And a room that smelled of lavender and beeswax, not at all of what such rooms could smell of when they were managed badly. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she stepped back outside without speaking to anyone. She wrote to Ashford the following morning. I retract my objections entirely. I was wrong about the nature of the work. I was also, I think, wrong about the woman. I shall say nothing further on the subject. On the third Thursday of January, Mrs. Albee arrived at the lying-in house at 10:30 in the morning, attended by her husband, who was a large man made helpless by fear, and who was placed by Uncle Humphrey in the kitchen with a fire and a task involving wood. Mrs. Albee was 34 years old, her fourth child, and the child was breech. Mrs. Carroway had known this for a week and had told Seraphine, and Seraphine had written to Dr. Fenn in Edinburgh and received his reply and read it 3 times. By 9 in the evening, Mrs. Albee had been in labor for 11 hours, and the child had not turned. And Mrs. Carroway was working with the concentration of a woman who has done this before and knows exactly how much concentration it requires. Seraphine was at Mrs. Albee's head, holding both her hands. Ashford was in the outer room, where he had been for 2 hours, sitting in a wooden chair with his hands folded, not reading, not writing, simply present. Because Seraphine had told him at the start of the evening that he was to be in the outer room and he was to stay there unless asked. At 9:30, Mrs. Carroway called through the door. We need another set of hands, not squeamish. Seraphine did not turn from Mrs. Albee's face. She said, Ashford, come. It was the first time she had used his Christian name in 21 years. He heard it the way a man hears a sound he has not heard in so long he had stopped expecting to hear it again. He came through the door and crossed to the bed. Kneel here, Mrs. Carroway said, and pointed. He knelt. Take her right hand. He took Mrs. Albee's right hand. Seraphine held the left. Mrs. Albee looked at him with the expression of a woman who is in too much pain to care who he was. Speak to her, Seraphine said, without looking up from Mrs. Albee's face. About anything that is not this room. Quietly. Ashford looked at Mrs. Albee's hand in his. He thought. And then he began to speak, quietly, in the voice he had used for 20 years in rooms where careful speech was required. He described the Vienna winter gardens in snow. He described the yellow of the glass house lamps against the white. How the light came through the glass in long rectangles across the frozen paths. And how the Empress kept an aviary in the east wing of the gardens. And how the birds were tropical birds, bright green and orange and red, that made their noise regardless of whether it was December, because inside the glass it was always May. He described the smell of oranges kept warm behind glass when outside it was -15, the particular sweetness of citrus in cold air. He described a Hungarian count of his acquaintance who had worn a hat of such architectural ambition that it had been necessary to tilt sideways through every doorway, and who had done this with perfect dignity for an entire diplomatic season, and who had never, not once, acknowledged that the hat was unusual. Mrs. Albee breathed through the contractions. She closed her eyes and opened them and breathed. Twice she laughed weakly at something Ashford said. Once about the hat, once about a trained dog in the Empress's household, who had attended 3 formal dinners before anyone identified it as a dog. Mrs. Carroway worked. Seraphine held Mrs. Alby's left hand and watched the woman's face and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and she knew it. At 10:40, the child was born, a girl, alive. She announced herself immediately, and the sound of her filled the room, and Mrs. Alby made a sound that was not quite a word. And Seraphine took the child, cleaned her, wrapped her in the linen that had been warming by the fire, and placed her against her mother's chest. Ashford was still holding Mrs. Alby's right hand. He did not know when to let go. "You may release her now, Ashford," Seraphine said from across the bed. "Thank you." He released the hand. He stood, and his legs were unsteady from 90 minutes on his knees on a stone floor, and he steadied himself against the bed frame for a moment. Seraphine crossed the room toward him, and she stopped 2 feet away, and she looked at him fully, for the first time in 3 months of Thursday attendance, and she placed her hand, briefly, on the back of his. 4 seconds. She did not press. She did not hold. She said, "Thank you." Again, quietly, as though the first time had been for the room, and this time was for him. He did not return the pressure. He did not need to. "Come into the kitchen," she said. "My uncle will want tea. You will have some. On Sunday you will come to Cresto Cottage at 4, and we will speak." He gave a single nod. He went out through the door, and as he passed Mrs. Carroway, who was sitting on the floor against the wall with her back straight and her eyes closed, the particular rest of a woman who has spent herself entirely in a good cause, she opened her eyes and said, without raising her voice, "She has never asked a man into this room before, my lord. Not the rector, not the apothecary, not one in 15 years. Think on that." He thought on it all the way to the kitchen, where Uncle Humphrey poured tea, and Mr. Alby shook his hand with both of his and wept without embarrassment. And Ashford drank his tea and said very little, and thought about what Mrs. Carroway had said, and what it meant that the first man Seraphine had ever called into that room was a man who had spent 21 years believing he was protecting her from difficulty. Sunday at 4 o'clock, Cresto Cottage Parlor. The door to the adjacent room was open. Uncle Humphrey was in there, audibly, with a book, and Seraphine had left it open herself, which told Ashford something about the nature of the meeting before it began. She sat across from him at the small table, and she spoke first. "I am 45, she said. "You are 48. If we do this, we do it without pretending we are the people we were at 24 and 27. I am not asking you to mourn them. I am asking you not to mourn them either." He met her eyes. "Yes," he said, "I do not move to Ingelow Hall. You come here, to this parish. The charity does not relocate, and it does not become the Ingelow charity or any variation of it." She watched his face. "I require no apology from you. I have not asked for one, and I do not want one. Forgiveness is not the sentence I intend to give. The sentence I intend to give is a different one, if you are willing to receive it." "What sentence?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "A life," she said. "Mine," continued, "with room in it for you, if you can fit yourself into the room that exists rather than the room you might prefer." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I spent 21 years in rooms I did not choose, doing work I was trained for in a life I had arranged. I am not asking for a particular room, Seraphine. I am asking to be in the house." Something in her face shifted. Not much, and not dramatically, but it was there. "Then we understand each other," she said. "Thursday at dinner, my lord. Uncle Humphrey makes a good soup." She stood and he rose, and she said, "Goodbye, Ashford. and he extended his hand, not to take hers but palm outward, the offer of a handshake as one equal to another at the end of a formal meeting, an acknowledgement with no claim in it. She looked at his hand. She considered it. She took it. Palm to palm, fingers loose, held for a count of 5, and then released. "Thursday at dinner, my lord," she said again. He walked back to the gloved hair in the cold afternoon, and when Mr. Finch asked if he wanted anything, Ashford shook his head and went upstairs. Because he did not trust his voice for the rest of the afternoon, and he saw no reason to test it unnecessarily. The following morning, he wrote out his agreement to every term, in his own hand, on a single sheet of paper, and sent it to the cottage. Seraphine read it at breakfast, folded it, and put it in the drawer of her writing desk, which was where she kept the things she intended to keep. 6 weeks before the wedding, in April, the herb garden behind the cottage was coming into its spring. Seraphine was walking Ashford through it, naming the plants and their uses, because he had asked and she had found, over the preceding months, that he asked questions and listened to the answers, which was not a quality she had expected, and which she found she valued more than she had anticipated. She stopped at the lavender, which was not yet flowering, but was already fragrant in the warm afternoon. She turned to face him. "Ashford," she said, "I am going to kiss you once now. I want you to know the kiss is not a promise. The promise is the wedding. The kiss is for me." His voice was quiet. "Yes," he said. She raised her right hand, the hand that wrote the pamphlets, the hand that had held Mrs. Alby's through 11 hours of labor, and placed it flat against the side of his jaw. She kissed him once, closed-mouthed and slow, a count of 6, and his hands did not move, and hers did not move. And there was nothing in the moment except the lavender and the weight of 21 years settling into something that was no longer a wound. She withdrew. Her hand rested against his jaw for a moment longer, then dropped. "Now," she said, "the valerian is along the far wall. We use it for the women who cannot sleep in the last weeks." She resumed walking. He followed her, and when he passed the lavender, his eyes were wet. And she noticed, and she did not comment, because some things do not require comment. In Rector Humphrey's study, in the second week of September, the 3 of them sat around the small desk. Humphrey in his chair, Seraphine and Ashford across from him. And Humphrey opened the parish register and asked them both the questions he was required to ask, and they answered them, and he wrote their names in his careful hand. And then he said, "First Sunday of October, then," and closed the register. And Seraphine said yes, and Ashford said yes, and Humphrey said he would put the kettle on. On the first Sunday of October, the parish church was full in the ordinary way of a Sunday morning. The same people in the same pews, the same arrangement of hats and bonnets, the smell of cold stone and beeswax candles, and the particular damp of a congregation assembled in autumn. Seraphine was in her usual pew, beside Uncle Humphrey, in her gray wool dress. Ashford was in the pew directly behind her, alone. Oberon was at Harrow until Christmas, and he had arrived early enough to be seated before she came in, so that she had not needed to acknowledge him, and he had not needed to arrange his face. Rector Humphrey rose to the lectern for the banns. He read the first 2 couples in the register, a farmer's son and a milliner's daughter, a widow and the schoolmaster. And then he said, in the same unhurried voice he used for everything, "I publish the banns of marriage between Miss Seraphine Cresto of this parish and the Right Honorable Ashford Trevelyan, Marquis of Ingelo of the parish of Aldenmere. If any of you know cause or just impediment why these 2 persons should not be joined together in holy matrimony, ye are to declare it." Seraphine did not turn around. Ashford did not lean forward. The church was very quiet. Uncle Humphrey, beside his niece, kept his eyes on the lectern with the expression of a man who is very pleased and has decided not to show it extravagantly. Mrs. Carroway, 3 rows back, closed her hymnal and unfolded her hands in her lap and sat very still. In the 3rd row from the front, Mrs. Alby's daughter, 8 months old and sitting in her mother's lap with the solemnity of a person who has survived something, reached up and closed her small hand around her mother's finger. Mrs. Alby looked down at her daughter for a moment, and then she looked across 3 pews at the back of Seraphine's head, and she smiled. The rector moved to the next prayer. The congregation settled. Outside, the October wind moved through the churchyard elms, and inside, in the warm and ordinary morning, 2 people sat in adjacent pews and did not need to look at each other to know the other was there. After the small wedding, 11 at dinner, Uncle Humphrey at the head of the table, Cressida beside Oberon, Mrs. Carroway at the far end with a glass of the good wine Ashford had brought from what remained of his Vienna cellar. After Humphrey retired to his room and Cressida took Oberon back to London for the last weeks of the holiday, the cottage was quiet in a way it had not been quiet before. A different kind of quiet. Seraphine went in first. She called him once by his Christian name from the room at the top of the stairs. He came. She was standing by the window in a plain white nightdress, her hair loose, the first time he had seen it loose since 1805, and it was silver now at the temples, and long, and she made no gesture toward it because it was simply her hair and she had not worn it to please anyone for a long time. The candle on the table threw a warm light across the room, and the window was open, and below in the garden the brook ran against its stones. "Ashford," she said, "I have not done this with anyone. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" He held her gaze. "Yes," he said, "I am 45. I require only that you be tonight the man who held Mrs. Alby's hand. Not the man who wrote the letter in 1805. Not the Marquis of Ingelo. The man who knelt on a stone floor for 90 minutes and talked about orange trees until a woman he had never met could breathe. I will be," he said. She did not move away from the window. She let him cross to her, which he did slowly, and she placed her palm flat against his chest, over his heart, where she could feel it, and looked up at him. "Blow out the candle, Ashford," she said. He reached past her and did. The window stayed open. Below in the garden, the brook ran against its stones, and the October air moved through the curtain. And in the dark, Seraphine's hand rested flat against his chest, and neither of them spoke, and neither of them needed to.